Hi, I'm Liam Dan. Welcome to the New Zealand Herald newsroom for the launch of our series, A New New Zealand, Rebuilding Better. Over the coming weeks and months, we're planning to take a deep dive into the issues that this country needs to face to ensure we're creating a stronger, fairer, greener and more prosperous economy. We know inflation and the cost of living is top of mind for most Kiwis right now, but we want to try and look through the current economic and political cycle and think about what we need to be doing to be where we want to be in the coming decades. With me today to get us started, I have some very special guests. Brad Olsen, Principal Economist from Infometrics. I have Natalie Vincent, Chief Executive Officer from Tangata Microfinance, and Mike Burrell, Executive Director from the Sustainable Business Council. Hi guys.
Morning.
Thanks for being here to solve all the big problems. No pressure. I think a good way maybe to get started would and introduce yourselves is just to talk about get a top priority from each of you with regards to where you see the big challenges. So, Mike, I'll start with you. I'm guessing there's some environmental challenges coming our way.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, I think the thing you'd expect me to say is climate change, and you'd be right. We're leading into COP27. Climate's on everyone's mind, but actually the other piece is the flip side of that, which is the social element. And I've just come back from a conference that's been talking about sustainability and actually social sustainability and the growing inequality that we're seeing over the last couple of years is as much on executives' mind at the moment as climate is. And in fact, the two sort of go together. I think we'll talk about productivity later on, but if you're not focused on productivity, if you're not focused on climate, then actually you are going to make things worse for those at the bottom of the heap.
Sure. Natalie, can you actually tell us a little bit about what Tangata Microfinance is and does and how that informs your view on where we need to be going?
Sure. So we work with low-income New Zealanders who are in financial hardship. We partner with the FinCap network of budget services and financial mentors across New Zealand, providing those that are financially excluded or can't access mainstream banking with interest-free, fee-free loans to either get on top of problem unmanageable debt or to purchase small family wellbeing assets. So what we're seeing is an increase in financial hardship, an increase in people with unmanageable debt, and on average, clients that come to us have an income of about $36,000. About 35% of that goes on debt repayment. Their average debt's about $13,000. So as you can imagine, put housing on top of that, and there's very little left for them to live on. Interestingly, what we've seen over the last couple of months is a higher level of income coming through to us. So people who are actually on the median income, around $56,000, who have got debt that is no longer manageable for them. They've probably been to their bank and sought some support, and it's not available to them. So that's really quite telling, I think, that we're now seeing people with higher levels of income coming to us, still low, obviously. Yeah. That's what we do. That's the sector we
presumably, immediately limits your ability to think long term once you're in that tough situation.
It affects your ability to think of the next day, let alone the future.
Yeah.
We're talking about people in extreme hardship, and the cost of living crisis, as people are referring to it as, it is a crisis, and it's something that needs addressing with immediate effect, because if we're talking about the future and taking everyone with us, this is a whole segment of society that we're looking to leave behind.
Yeah. Hey, look, Brad, so when we talk about the economy, we're often quite ruthless talking about it at a macro level.
The spreadsheets are good, right? But they don't really tell you a lot about real people.
Yeah. How do you integrate that kind of reality for people out there right now into a sort of an economic way forward?
I mean, the economy is not divorced from people. People make up the economy. I think that's a really big one. And for me, when we look at the challenges that are ahead, I think the focus has got to be on people. And there's many ways that we look at that, from the structures that need to be in place to support people. If we've got people that are going to school, into a school that is run down and has mould on the walls, if they're going into hospital and they're not able to get that support, or again, the services just aren't up to scratch, then we're on a hiding to nothing. And I think the worry, though, is that we look as well at sort of some of our educational attainment containment, and we are in that sort of more survival than thriving mode for New Zealand, where we're able to go through day to day at an aggregate level, but again, below the surface, we look at those distributional hits, and we know there are some who are incredibly challenged. I think going ahead, that's one of the major concerns, is we know we've got to invest in people. We know that we've got to do better on the employment front, we've got to do better on the education front, but that has to have a focus on what people are seeing in their day-to-day lives. And the big one for me really still remains housing, because look, it's very, very clear, if I have a bad night's sleep, I wake up the next morning, I'm a pretty rubbish worker, most people are. So if you have people that are constantly in housing distress, if they're worried about living day-to-day, like Natalie's been talking about, that's a struggle where you're not able to think long-term. We need to support people, I think, through those short-term hits, and then think about how we position ourselves for the future, because I think too often we do focus on the right here and now. We think about what's politically expedient, not what's good, not only for the economy, but for society more generally as we head into the long term. We've got some massive challenges in front of us, and I'm sort of worried that, like we had back in the 80s, we sort of stumble into them. All of a sudden we realise we need to make a very rapid change, but because we've put it off for so long, it's so hard to transition that we hit families where it hurts the hardest.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, you must feel that dilemma between short-term and long-term thinking all the time in the climate change space, because it's about the costs, and when we we were sort of having to look at paying costs right now for something where the payoff may be down the track, right?
That's right. I wouldn't say it's about the costs. I'd say it's about the timing of the costs.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
I mean, another way for sustainability, to describe sustainability, is foresight. It's looking ahead. And, we used to be quite good at this, actually. New Zealand, I think, was quite well leading in having foresight, looking ahead beyond the day-to-day, 5, 10, 15 years ahead. And we've kind of lost that. We really are in the news cycle, and we really are focused on the immediate. And so I would say that if you look at the medium term, so if you look out, say, to 5 to 10 years, then it makes a lot of sense to be investing in, for example, climate action, because the impact on your business is going to be really significant. What we're seeing is that companies that belong to Sustainable Business Council and are doing that. They're recognising that actually this isn't a little clip-on onto the side. You need to bring this into core business. Why? Because it's about risk. It's about recognising that if you don't look out 5, 10 years, there's massive risk barrelling down the road. You're going to get hit by that. But you're also going to miss the opportunities. And I think this is one of the most important things that we're seeing, is that those companies that are looking ahead. So, for example, Volvo just announced yesterday it's going full electric by 2026. No, it's not doing that because it's a nice thing to do. It's doing that because it recognises that's where the economy is going. That's where it needs to be. And if you go back, a camera before, if you go back to the technology changes, if you go to camera technology, why did Sony get ahead? Sony got ahead because they bet on new technology. They didn't try to hold on to the old stuff. The other camera companies tried to hold on to the other stuff. Some of them don't even exist anymore. So I would say,
Kodak now.
as a really good example. The other thing I would say is that once you start taking that medium-term view, then your CFO can start to say, I can see how I can make this work, because I'm looking at what this looks like, what the maturity time frame is for my investment, also what my risk period is here. So it changes everything when you start looking out a bit further. So it just makes good business sense.
Can I throw in the one to any of you? But while we're on that climate change thing, the really hot one for New Zealand is agriculture, isn't it? And that kind of looking forward technology. Does it frustrate you where we're at with the debate on that? I mean, it's a complicated one.
It is complicated, and I mean, does it frustrate me? Slightly, it does. Particularly as I know many of the companies are making those investments right now. You saw an announcement only a few weeks ago about a major joint venture between 6, 7 of our leading agriculture companies together with government. They're going to commit well over $200 million to bring that curve of emissions down in the agriculture sector. They need to do it. They're looking to do it, and they're looking for international partnerships as well. Interestingly, that wasn't a story that people were interested in, and yet to me that is the story, because we've got to make these changes, and that degree of investment shows how seriously they're taking it. I think in agriculture, what you're seeing there is I suppose the politics playing out, rather than what I'd say the commercial imperative and the discussions that are happening in boardrooms all around New Zealand at the moment, which is we can see what's happening, we know what we need to do, let's start taking action. putting our money where our mouth is and putting our priority where our mouth is. And you're seeing that with leading companies in New Zealand doing that.
I think it's clear as well that we can't just sit still and not do anything. And I think that's the worry that I have at the moment, is that we often in New Zealand, I'm sure it's true around the world as well, but we sometimes seem to let perfect be the enemy of the good. And that worries me, because I sort of look at it and I go, we all recognise that, but we're still unwilling to move. And what's fascinating me talking to some business leaders is some very much get it, but interestingly, some are getting it now just from, as we were talking about before, the pure economics of it. They're going, actually, doesn't really matter my view on it, in terms of a business stance. You just go, actually, there's money to be made here. And I think that's interesting that it's starting to flow through. But again, it starts to highlight some of the issues that we're going to have in society. We've seen these sort of industrial transitions before. We know that the primary sector is a key part of the New Zealand economy, but we know that that's also, that shift along is going to hit households hard.
And I think that's really important. What I heard at this conference I was at the other day was you just got to get on with it. We're going to have to learn a lot of this stuff. If you stand back and say, well, we don't know what that last 5 years of the transition is going to look like. Well, no one does. So what you do is you focus on the first 5 years and get that going. In 5 years' time, 10 years' time, you'll have a different perspective. The technology would have changed. The entire competitive environment would have changed. So getting on with it's really important. I think perfection is the enemy of the good.
Natalie, I see you nodding, because that political dimension must be frustrating to you, where political parties are led by the marginal voters, polling, and don't ever quite seem to tackle some of those big issues.
Yeah, and I mean, climate change, everything is saying that, it's vitally important, right, for our sustainability, for everything. So none of these things are exclusive of each other, but we're leaving people behind. And when you're talking about acting fast, doing it now, not waiting for perfect, but getting on with good, that's what we need to do for looking after people. We have got people in desperate times in this country, and it is only getting worse. We're seeing people that were keeping their heads just above water, now no longer able to do that. Incomes are just too low here. Benefits are just too low. You cannot live on it. We need livable incomes. We need to lift people up. And we need to put that investment into people. If we want all of these other things to improve in the future, we need to make that people investment now.
And to that focus, we're talking about the new New Zealand, right? One thing that gets me is that the way we've responded to COVID was very different from the last time we hit an economic shock. Last time around GFC, we sort of waited for things to happen. We waited for people to lose their jobs, and we started to support them through benefits. We let the automatic stabilisers work. I think this time around, that's a reactive response. This time around, we took it proactively. We said, what happens if we can support people through this so we don't have as much economic scarring? And I look at that and I go, actually, that to me is a bit of a framework for the future. And in that context, particularly around the climate, a lot of experts are saying, including us, why aren't we thinking about something like a carbon dividend? Instead of the government taking all this money from the emissions trading scheme, which is a good scheme, but then letting government dictate the winners and losers, you go, actually, let's give it back to the households, let's smooth that pathway, because it is incredibly tough for people at the moment. And instead of, again, and I think that's going to be something we're going to have to consider a lot more in the future, is that at the moment we're not necessarily going back to people and saying, how can we help you, what sort of supports are needed. It's more, this is happening, and the train is leaving and you're on board whether you like it or not. That's a challenge.
And I think that is a challenge. And I think what I like about what you've just said around the carbon dividend is that it's a more dynamic approach to what's often called the just transition. I think often people have seen the just transition as a planning dilemma. If we just get our plans right, it'll all come up. Well, that's not what it's about. It's about how can you be responsive now to what's coming down the track. And I think that's one way of doing it. The other for me, though, is if you start focusing on poverty, if you start focusing on inequality, many of the issues that you have to confront there are precisely the issues that you're going to have to confront in 10 years' time with the just transition towards a low-carbon economy. They're the same things. And I lived through the 80s. I saw the high unemployment rate. I lived on the west coast of New Zealand. Where at one stage, people of my age, 35% of us were unemployed. Now, that's not the kind of transition we want. That's a pretty rough transition, right? So to me, this is a really good place to start. Training ourselves for these big impacts. If we can't get it right now in relatively benign climate, then imagine what it's going to be like when we're in a very challenging climate.
Yeah, and then the point that you both touched on there is how we react to a crisis in this country, often quite well. Like New Zealanders sort of suddenly come out of their shells when things get very dramatic, but the rest of the time maybe a bit more cautious. Do you guys see COVID? This is a central question of this series. Is COVID a sort of a reset, a chance to just a model to sort of draw on, to do things now differently, or is it just a big distraction and a big cost that we have to deal with? Natalie,
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking about the cost of living crisis now. That's very real. But I think we are forgetting that actually there was a whole lot of people in New Zealand that were in financial crisis a long time before COVID, right? You know, the benefits have been too low since the 90s, since the changes in the 90s. People were struggling to make ends meet, hence our charity was set up in the first place with a whole lot of others. So there was already these problems. I think COVID has really shone a light on that. It's created a bit more social empathy. You know, other people that were not struggling or have never experienced struggling suddenly were, or they had job changes, or they had lockdowns, and suddenly you're like, oh man, it must be, you know, pretty hard for those people out there. So I think that's what we see as change, and I think there's an opportunity now for us, while we've still got that bit of social empathy, to actually say we've got an opportunity here to actually do something better for the really marginalised, deprived New Zealanders. Let's be really active, let's invest in people, and, you know, 5 years' time we will see better social returns. People will be doing better.
I think, I mean, one thing that COVID was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, from our sort of the way that we operate and go through things, and sort of it shook up the model a bit. It sort of said that, hey, when we need to, we can actually sort of break things and figure out a different way to go about it. I think the worry I have as well, though, is that it did press pause on some of these issues around, you know, when we look at those who are in the hardest positions. Not that we ignored them fully, but I do sort of feel like we put some of those bigger issues on ice for a few years until we got out of crisis mode. And it's now sort of incumbent on us as a country to go, okay, where is the pathway that we're trying to chart? And again, I mean, from an economic point of view, I think of infrastructure, I think of our healthcare system, I think of education, and go, again, if we don't unlock those sort of things and don't put them in a bit of place, then again, we're always sort of just adding another patchwork on a patchwork. And at some point, those threads all unwind and we find ourselves in a bad spot. So we've actually got to be willing to stump up the money to actually invest in people, to invest in good quality services, because otherwise we will not get anywhere into the future. I know there are challenges, I know there's a limited pot of money, but it means that increasingly, with demographic changes coming through, with climate change, we're going to have to get a lot smarter with our money, with our people, with our resources, because there isn't an infinite supply. But the longer we leave it, the more we sort of, you know, turn a blind eye to it, the harder it is to actually get through.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what you both said. I think this was a jolt. You know, it was a real jolt. We've been careering along, you know, serenely since '89. Since the wall came down in '89, we thought that we were in this new world. Well, it turned out we weren't. It turned out that, you know, that real politics is still there. It turns out there's still business cycles. It turns out you can still be unemployed and you can still be living in poverty. So this kind of third way that we talked about in the 90s turned out to be a bit of a fool's errand, you know.
I mean, we hadn't had a recession. We had an extremely long boom.
Very long boom.
Whether it was a boom or not, but a time with no recession.
Second longest in history. And that's right. So I think this was a wake-up call. It was the jolt that we needed. I don't think it was the transformation that people talked about. People got a little bit excited and talked about this being a transformational moment. It wasn't. What it was, though, it was the wake-up call, it was the jolt. Now, the question is, and to Natalie's point, is what do we do with that jolt? And I think we've probably got another year or two to hang on to those memories of just how big this was, how quickly we could turn supply chains around, how quickly we could change economic policy on the fly. It didn't have to go as slow as it did before. We will quickly forget that. We will quickly forget that, and we will go back into business as usual. And that's not what we can do with climate. That's not what we can do with inequality. We've actually got to stay in that more, you know, proactive, active mode. And I do worry that we might squander that. And
but
so,
we've also got to bring people along. I think the worry that I'm certainly seeing at the moment, I've talked to a lot of groups about this, is sort of an inability to disagree agreeably. You know, we're not bringing everyone with us. There has been, in my mind, an increase in division in this country, and it means that, you know, people are not only not listening to each other, they're just not even engaging at all. And you are sort of seeing those different camps. Now, I don't want to overblow it. It's not that you have half the country pitted against the other, but there is a large enough group of people that I think feel disenfranchised that, regardless of whether or not you know, that's a legitimate position or whatever you take, I think the fact that there are those groups means that we do have to work a lot harder of how we actually bringing everyone on this journey, rather than that sort of leadership style of I'm already there and you will follow me sort of thing. And there needs to be a better conversation about how that goes. And, you know, I think the sort of people you'd work with in your area, you know, they don't have the time or the luxury to think about some of these bigger issues. They're trying to live day to day. And the failing of leadership to actually address those issues in the short and long term means that, again, they don't have the opportunity to engage. They don't have the opportunity to participate.
No, absolutely. They're excluded. They're excluded.
They're often treated as almost, you know, the
problem,
scapegoats
a problem. treated as a problem.
Yeah,
that's right.
Not contributing New Zealanders that with the right investment will be fantastic. We're excluding them. Yeah.
It's very true. We do an annual survey called Better Futures. We do it with Kantar, and it looks at what the sort of top issues are for New Zealanders. And all of the top issues are the issues you would expect there to be.
Yeah.
Cost of living,
Yeah.
poverty, increasing gap, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
It takes you till you get down to about number 9 before you get to climate change. And it's to the point that you made before, Brad, which is if you don't deal with the hierarchy of needs, the basic essential things first, you can't get to those higher order things.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
to people who say, well, we just have to focus on the environment, they're missing the point. You have to focus on people as well,
Yeah.
or else you don't have the support, both the political support and the public support for these other actions.
You need to get people on board.
You really do.
There would be very few people, I would suspect, that actually are not concerned about the climate or would want to do what they can. But if you're thinking about tomorrow how you're going to pay your rent, or are you going to lose your house next Friday, or how are you going to feed your children, I'm afraid climate change is way down your list of priorities. How are you going to make your debt repayments? What is the future going to look like for you? Climate doesn't feature.
And very directly, you take a low-income family at the moment who needs to get their kids to school, they need to get themselves to work and similar. They're not going to have a brand new EV. They're not going to have a Tesla car or anything. And as much as I'm sure you go and ask them and you say, look, if you had the opportunity, would you? Yeah, I'm sure a lot of them would, but financially it's just not viable.
Yeah.
And again, that goes to the transition and similar where, those who are in that position are doing a lot of work, I understand that. But again, there are a lot who can't make that transition, who are effectively locked out of being part of it. And then at some point will probably become the scapegoats as well, and we'll say, well, you haven't come through, you haven't transitioned, you're holding us back. Well, we haven't given them the opportunity to move forward.
No.
I mean, I think we know we're going to switch political parties every 3, 6 or 9 years, pretty much. Do you feel that there is a way we can build some consensus around some of these issues? We sort of have seen some bipartisan stuff on the housing zoning issue in the past couple of years. I guess we kind of have a consensus on some of the broader economic stuff in this country, but can our major parties sort of work together?
Well, I think on climate they've shown they can.
Yep.
The very fact that we've set up an independent climate change commission, we've got an act in place, we've just signed off the first climate budgets for the next 15 years, and we got bipartisan support for that. So I think when push comes to shove and the issues are big enough, then we can see that bipartisanship. I think we're beginning to see it, and perhaps in social policy, for example. I heard some conversation recently about, the National Party beginning to look at the work that Bill English did on using a long-term investment model for social issues.
Impact.
Yeah. So that's encouraging as well. What I would like us to see is to sort of carve out these areas which are so important to New Zealand in the medium to long term, and then come up with common approaches to those. Obviously, there will be nuance on the on-the-ground policy. That's fine. But if we can mark out the general direction and get parties to focus on that general direction, I think that's much more helpful to New Zealand. I think this is super important because what we're seeing in Europe, and we're seeing it in the United States at the moment, is the kind of divisions where you can't have these debates. I feel like we've got a window where we still can, and we can still set those longer term objectives.
I feel like we've got to make some commitments. I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and I only say that because I feel like there's a lot of times that we identify some of these issues, and I think one of the things that has come through recently from government departments sounds very policy wonky, but the long-term insights briefings have been good. We've recognised some of the big challenges. Are we willing to do anything about them? Seemingly not. We've had Treasury again sort of talk about the likes of New Zealand Super and the super age and similar, yet no one, it seems like every Prime Minister would rather be turfed out than ever going anywhere near that one. And I worry because it also means that we haven't got that direction setting so that we can make long-term decisions because we're not willing to make the policy commitments. Let's look at earlier this year, the cost of living crisis, an immediate issue in front of us meant that the government subsidised fuel. Now, one, that's inconsistent with our climate goals. Probably more importantly, it also gives 3 times as much support to those on the highest incomes who need it not at all as those on the lowest incomes who need it desperately. And I go, that's fine. We can have these ideas about where we want to go in the future and the aspiration, but unless we're willing to put our money where our mouth is and actually get committed to this, it's just a lot of hot air. And I recognise I'm sort of standing here in front of a camera talking, so the hot air is a little bit around me as well. But let's get serious about, unless people are willing to make those commitments, unless we're willing to chart a long-term vision, then a lot of this is going to be for nothing.
And one close to your heart, obviously, something like a capital gains tax, a large structural change gone. You know?
Oh, always. I mean, all of those big decisions are. But see, again, the policy consistency does concern and challenge me sometimes. We sort of wrote off the likes of a capital gains tax at 15%, I think it was. I didn't hear any blowback when there's an effective capital gains tax through the Bright Line test at 33 to 39%. People seem fine with that. There's certainly not been the riots on the streets that people were promising around a CGT. And I say that because, again, the consistency becomes important. We've got to get a lot more long-term thinking, because now, again, either we do it now, we plan well for the future, or we hit that sort of stop all of a sudden, and the transition costs are so much sharper, so much more painful, and will leave so much more people in a difficult position.
Can I put a positive piece on this as well?
Yes.
Though? I think,
Thank you.
because I think you're right, Brad, but I think we're talking about public policy a lot here. There's also agency among individuals, among community groups and NGOs, and among the business community. And what we're seeing, for example, among our members, is they're saying, you know, we can't wait for the policy. We can't wait for perfection. We've got to get on with it now. Why? Our own team members, our own employees are saying, we're purpose-driven. We come to work thinking you're doing good things. If you're not, this is a very tight labour market. We'll walk. We will walk. If you want to keep us, you need to say. But you're also seeing changes in the boardroom. You're seeing changes in, around the executive table. People actually care about this stuff. They're saying it is important to our bottom line, but it's also important because it's the right thing to do. And so they are taking action almost regardless of what government policy is. Government policy can enhance that. It can also make it worse as well. But actually, you are seeing a lot of action. And so in the area, if I talk about the social sustainability side, boardrooms are worried about poverty. They can see it. And so you're seeing a lot more action in that space than I've seen probably in the last 10 years. Why? Because they care and they realise if they don't do something about it, no one's going to do anything about it. Yep. So I think sometimes you can cut through the challenges of public policy by just getting on with it.
Well, needs must, right? And look, as a Zoomer, as a Gen Zer, it's abundantly clear, like say in the labour market, young people are increasingly going, look, yes, the money is important, certainly in the cost of living crisis, but there's also longer term, there's issues around culture. What are we standing for? What are we doing? If it's just, I feel like we've moved away a little bit from the transactional focus that work used to have on it, particularly since COVID. People have gone, actually, there's a little bit more to life, both in terms of what I do at work and what I do outside of, office hours. So you're absolutely right, there is a transition. I'm glad that I'm feeling a little bit more upbeat now.
Go. I think that's true. Like, we see that a lot, businesses doing good and making contributions, but it can't. That's just not enough. No. It can't just happen like that. This has to be a partnership across all of us: business, government, community, everyone working together. And whilst it's amazing to see people doing these good things, it's system change, it's structural things that need to change within government policy to lift people out of poverty. It's a big job. There's been lots of.
If you could pick a policy, is there something that you would say, do it now?
Income support.
Yeah.
And benefits. There's been a lot of recommendations and research and, all sorts of people across the community saying this, you need to act on this, how many years ago now, but, it needs to happen now.
So the kids who didn't have a choice where they were born get a fair go.
We need to increase benefits. They are just not livable. Yep. And, and all those ridiculous myths about people receiving a benefit. They need to be slammed. People need to talk about that more. Being on a benefit is not your choice in a lot of cases, right? We need to increase benefits. We need to look at working for families, awful name, tax credits. We need to give back to the people that cannot afford to live.
We're bumping up against time. There's just one thing you mentioned age, not me, Brad. Zoomer on, but it's sort of not a revelation to anyone, but we're getting older. The population is getting older. We're going to have a much older population. A lot of the things that we're worried about around workforce, job shortages aren't going anywhere, right? Because people are retiring. We're going to have about 40% of the population over 60, I think, by about 2040. How do we plan for that?
Well, I mean, the thing that we need to look at is, at the moment, the sort of workforce challenges that we're having right here, right now, are a portal into the future. They are exactly what we will see as we head into the 2020s, into the 2030s and similar rather, because we know that over the next, I think, 30 years or so, there's going to be, over 1 million additional people over the age of sort of 65 and that coming forward. And importantly, the one that really concerns me is that back in the 1980s, 1990s, you had 6 workers supporting every 1 retiree. In the next few years, you're going to have something like maybe 2 working people supporting every retiree. So it is getting a lot more difficult. And also says that mantra of, we've got to work smarter, not harder. We desperately do, because we aren't going to have people to work harder. And there's only so many hours in the day. We know people are already stressed in the short term. That's not going to get any easier in the long term. But I think as well, the distributional issues are still there. Housing is my major issue. Again, we still haven't cracked that one. And we're now seeing those who are currently trying to buy their house in a challenging position. They will be in that challenging position for a longer time unless we put supports in place now. The big worry I have is that a lot of the policies we're talking about here take a long time to enact. You don't click your fingers and sort housing, you don't click your fingers and sort incomes, you certainly don't click your fingers and sort climate all here right now. But the longer we leave it to make those decisions, the longer you push out the ability to actually make change. That's my worry for the next generation, is that they will be lumped with the cost of this and not have the ability to actually influence the change as we are right here, right now.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
We have.
So just on that, I'd say if you want to see our future, look to Japan. Aging population, massive depopulation in the rural areas, some major crises. Why are they able to get through it? Because they've got such high productivity. If it wasn't for the fact that they had an incredibly productive economy and that they were able to get by on that, they would actually be in a spiral at the moment. We don't match that economy currently. That's the thing that worries me. I worry the fact that if we look out 20 years from now and we're in the same position as Japan, we won't be well placed. So we do need to make those transitions. We do need to be saying, actually, why aren't we getting in behind being a much more modern economy, a much more contemporary economy?
Investing in R&D, all those things.
All of those sorts of things, and also
and
the
people.
way and the training that goes with that. Because we need to become a sticky economy. At the moment, it's much more attractive for young New Zealanders to go abroad. But it needs to be attractive for them to stay or come back, and for us to be able to attract talent. And currently, I don't think we are that attractive. And so that's, to me, if you're talking about one policy, it's look through that prism, through that lens. If you're a government, say, what would make New Zealand attractive for other people to either to stay here, for our Zoomers to stay, but also for others to come here, because migration is going to be critical. Absolutely critical to us being able to continue to grow.
And Natalie, there's low unemployment now. There are jobs there, but there's a disconnect because, and a lot of people don't sort of understand, but there are social cultural reasons why some people are not in the right space to, turn up at an office for a job and things like that. How do we sort of bridge that divide, bring those people into the workforce, and get away from the old tropes of, some people being lazy or whatever. There are people who just don't have the skills to get into the workforce, even with unemployment so low.
Well, I think, the reasons that people are receiving a benefit are very varied. It can be health reasons, it can be raising small children, there's a lot of things. But also what we see is lots of people who are working, or they're receiving a benefit and part-time working, but the minimum wage, if you've got a minimum wage job, you can't live on that, and people are borrowing to pay for their essential living costs on top of that. So it's not just about getting people into jobs. I just don't believe that it's just about getting them into any job, a minimum wage job. I think it's about education and training and development and investing in our people so they can actually get jobs that they can live on, right? So that is not a quick fix. But while we work through, like what Brad was saying, while we work towards that, we need to take action now, or we're leaving all of these people behind, and they're people that we will need in the future. They are people that we will need.
I'm going to have to wrap it up, but I will finish on you, Brad. And I was going to sort of, because the others, just to give you that one policy that if you were in charge tomorrow, what's the one policy that you would put in place that might help shift the dial?
Probably housing. It would still be housing. I mean, that's just so critical. If you don't sort that, finances are ruined, but also, people just in a short term don't get up well in the morning, they're not able to go and work.
So we have the land starting to come right. Is it the capital gains tax?
In all honesty, put some serious money behind infrastructure. I mean, we can sort all the other issues, but at the moment, the issue that we're facing is that we're still not able to actually grow the economy. We're not able to grow the housing stock in that because people are not able to develop in the right areas. We're not putting the right pipes in. Everyone's fighting over, not in my backyard because, we're not sorted on that front. But I think that my bigger worry is that I think we've also got to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, I think is the saying. There's a lot of talk, particularly in the social housing spaces, take all the money we use for emergency housing and just use it to build houses. What are you going to do with the people in the meantime? We've got to continue to house them. I think that's the worry. As we move forward, as we craft those longer term pieces, and we've also got to actually enable people to stick around now, because the utopia we're focusing on 30, 40 years time might be fantastic. If no one can make it to that utopia, what's the point?
Exactly right.
And I guess that
We
comes
all
back to
agree.
leadership and selling the idea that things are complex. There can be more than one thing going on at once. Look, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for that. I know we haven't solved all the issues, but we've certainly set a great platform for this series. So thanks, guys. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
As we emerge from the shadow of the pandemic, we've got some talking to do as a nation. Where do we need to focus to ensure we rebuild a better New Zealand? COVID has been a distraction from many of the plans we were making to develop the economy and build a wealthier and more equitable nation. But does it also present some opportunity to reset and do things differently? Does our response to COVID offer a blueprint for tackling other big challenges we face? Or does it require a different approach? The new New Zealand Rebuilding Better is a major new series from the New Zealand Herald and NZME, which seeks to answer these questions and help lay the pathway for a fairer and more prosperous Aotearoa. The project will focus on a series of themes, starting with the economy, before moving on to health, social division, crime, national identity, and more. Along the way, we will look at these issues through the lenses of climate and equality to ensure plans are sustainable and support all Kiwis. The project will include video, polls, podcasts, data analysis, interactive features, and stories from across our network of publications and radio stations. Coverage will continue into 2023, leading into one of New Zealand's most pivotal elections. We also want to hear from you. We want to create a space for constructive debate and go beyond traditional political divides to find some common ground. So join us as we play our role in creating a new New Zealand by rebuilding better.